Hi everybody, welcome to our webinar and thank you for joining us. My name is Anna Salter, I'm Head of Evaluation here at Kantar UK, and I'm delighted to welcome Amy Tiernan, who is Head of Strategic Communications at KPMG UK. And I'm going to ask first of all just to say welcome to Amy, and could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your role, please?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Anna. So as Anna said, I head up strategic communications at KPMG. This is a key part of the firm's corporate affairs function. And my team really is about taking a longer term approach to managing KPMG's reputation. So it's about planning, developing and executing integrated communications campaigns and content in support of the firm's strategic objectives.
Great, thank you very much. So I think most people hopefully have joined us by now, so we might launch into our content without any further ado. So now we at Kantar have been working with KPMG for quite a few years now, and the team at KPMG have recently implemented a new way of doing things, so a new approach to media research and analysis. And the idea here is that they're looking beyond just pure media, and tracking the sentiment of multiple stakeholders. And the way they're doing this is looking at publicly accessible content, and we'll go into that in a little bit more detail as we go on. But first of all, I think my question to Amy is, what prompted you to consider looking at things a little bit differently and this new approach to measuring your activities?
Yes, thanks, Anna. So I think as Anna touched on, before we were absolutely tracking sentiment amongst our key stakeholder audiences, but we were very much doing it in silos and in pockets. So different teams were owning different bits of data and information, and we didn't really bring it all together to tell one kind of coherent story. So my team was really keen about sort of bringing this insight together and making sure that that was then informing our overall reputation strategy, and actually that we were using the data to inform our activities. Because often there's a lot of tracking data, but then it's sort of what do you do with that data? So we had the idea of trying to bring it together into one tracker, and we worked closely with Kantar on that ambition to make it a reality.
Great. Okay, so you were looking for something that was consistent across a lot of different parts of the organisation. It sounds like there are two angles here, though. So one is managing how you're communicating with your external stakeholders and understanding that, and another is how you satisfy the requirements of your internal stakeholders. So how did you manage that tension?
Yeah, so what we wanted to do is we wanted to have lots of data at our fingertips, but we wanted to be able to cut that data in a number of different ways to really give us the insight in terms of what was landing, what was driving our sentiment amongst our key audience groups, but also being able to drill down into that data to understand what were the key topics, how were our different stakeholders viewing us, and sort of using that then to inform what we were doing. So, for us, this was about working with the different teams within corporate affairs to really understand what kind of data we had already. And we wanted to ensure that whatever we developed was going to work for all of the different teams, and, sort of really understanding how they were going to use that data. So again, it was really important that, as well as having that overall picture of, the overall score, what does it all look like grouped together, that we were actually still able to drill down into, media or our external stakeholders, political stakeholders, etc. And then I think for us as well, we wanted to be able to demonstrate to the leadership that we were tracking against, the firm's key strategic objectives. So for us, it was very important to be able to track against key themes that we're, wanting to proactively push out into the market. So again, thinking about and working very closely with Kantar in terms of, well, these are our ambitions. This is what we're trying to do as a function, and how can we get the data to sort of demonstrate where are we making progress, but equally, where are we maybe falling a bit behind? Where are we not doing as well as we could be? And what's kind of driving sentiment for our key competitors as well.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so just thinking about how we get under the bonnet a little bit now. How did you go about deciding which groups to track? Oh, sorry, I've gone giving a sneak preview of the wrong slide there. Apologies. There we are. Getting a bit keen.
Yeah, so we worked really closely. First of all, we started with our corporate affairs function to understand what we were tracking already. You know, we're quite clear as a function, you know, who are our key external stakeholders. So we sort of grouped that all together and sort of ended up with these kind of 3 buckets, I suppose, which we've got at here in terms of sort of media. So what was showing up in media, but also quite importantly, what were our key journalists saying about us? So we also track sort of their social media as part of this to get that sentiment analysis. Then this was really the domain of our external affairs team. So, you know, thinking about politicians, you know, kind of what was being said about us by politicians, both in terms of their social media, but also parliamentary records. And this section also includes trade bodies, academics, sort of other important stakeholder influencer groups that we wanted to understand what were they saying about us. And then a third bucket really around general public. So this is obviously quite broad. And this is mainly looking at things like social media and blogs to just get a bit of a sense of what's the conversation about KPMG. And for us, it's really interesting to see which topics sort of from the media really capture the public's imagination. So sometimes we can get some quite different topics coming through in the general public area. I think it's also worth saying that because we are running this as a pilot at the moment, we are very much taking a kind of test and learn approach to this. So originally we actually had four different stakeholder groups. We'd split out the politicians and the MPs, and then we had the trade groups and academics in another group. But we kind of realised after doing this for a number of months that actually the volumes in those stakeholder groups was quite small when you compare it to, for example, the media and even general public. So we decided to bring the MPs and the trade bodies into one sort of group. And we've also had a look at the weightings. So I think we started off as a bit of a sort of, you know, each group had an equal weighting, and we have now sort of rebalanced that because of the volumes that we are getting in the media, and also because obviously the media is then influencing some of the other stakeholder groups. We felt that it was more representative to kind of go for a 60-20-20 split. But you know, that is the approach we're taking. We're using this, we're looking at what insight it's giving us, and we're sort of understanding, does this give us a true picture, or, you know, should we be thinking about how it's presented? And, you know, we're working very closely with the team on that as it evolves.
Great. Okay. Long may it continue that the politicians aren't talking about the industry too much, I think.
Yes.
Cool. So what kind of insights are you getting from this study so far, Amy?
Yeah, so this gives a bit of a snapshot in terms of what kind of data we get on a monthly basis from the tracker. So, you know, the bold green line is KPMG. It's our sentiment trends. I think it's actually worth pointing out that you know, this is very much based on an impact score. So it's not volume led. It's more about combining you know, kind of where the relevance of pieces, the prominence, the reach, and the sentiment, and that is all combined into one score. So the lines that you see are more of an impact rather than a volume, which I think is worth pointing out. Obviously, you'll see from this chart that through the months we can sometimes get quite a lot of sort of ups and downs in terms of our daily sentiment. And this really just highlights for us, well, what are the key things that are driving that positive sentiment? What are the key pieces that are really cutting through for our different audiences? And likewise, on the flip side, what are the negatives that are dragging our sentiment down? We're then able to compare, the other lines represent our competitors. And so we're able again to track what are their key highlights for the month. And again, what are sort of the peaks and troughs. And I think as part of this, we also have a sort of industry average line, so we can really understand where are we, showing up above the industry and industry standard, and where are we, below it. So yeah, it just gives us a really useful snapshot. I would say that on month by month, these do change quite a lot. So it is very interesting in terms of, sort of what it shows us. And we haven't got any slides on it, but we also do a sort of longer term view of what that's looking like. So you kind of get the month snapshot, but then you get that longer term. Okay, well, what does that mean based on previous months, and how overall are we performing?
Yeah, great, thank you. So one of the things you mentioned was asking being able to demonstrate to your senior management that you're really landing key messages and shaping your narrative across all data sets, not just across the media. And I think one of the things that helps here is that you're able to use this to demonstrate to them that there's more to life than just what appears in the FT, for example. So, I mean, how have you supported the process of really being able to, selling this in internally and helping those, your organisation, not just the senior people, but the whole organisation understand and look beyond the obvious narrative within media?
Yeah, I think, that was one of the key reasons we wanted to do this. We wanted to be making our decisions and driving our actions based on data and the insight that was showing us, rather than, I'm sure probably other people on the call have had this as well, that, kind of people's views can be shaped by reading one particular paper or by talking to one particular client or friend. So we wanted to be able to sort of say, okay, actually what you're saying is true because the data is backing that up, or likewise giving them a bit of a different perspective and saying, okay, yes, there was that difficult article in a particular newspaper, but actually the work that we did over here and this piece of research actually landed really well. It went across different audience groups, and actually we've reached some new audiences because of it. So it was really just to, I think, we're just very keen that what we're doing is informed by data, and it's not informed by a few people's perspectives on what they think is happening. So, it's quite hard to argue against the data, and we find this a very useful tool when we're, talking to kind of senior leaders and trying to sort of push things through from our side. And Anna, I don't know if you want to go on to the next slide, because this is we find this a really useful slide for us. So we kind of get this on a monthly basis, and it basically shows us, well, which topics are landing, but also sort of what impact are they having? So kind of, in a crude sense, kind of how are they influencing our overall score? So, given this is just an example, but, a piece of research, actually, that's giving us, because we did that, it gave us, plus 10. And then how does that compare with, some of the regulatory cases that we're dealing with at the moment, and what's the negative impact of those? So it's a very useful way to show to our stakeholders within the business what sort of impact both the positive, proactive things that we're doing are having, but also what we're having to deal with in terms of the negative side and how it all sort of plays all together. Now, I think, everybody knows that calculating our reputation isn't a simple equation of, a good piece of research is plus 10, that balances out, a negative regulatory case. We know it is not that simple, but I think it does demonstrate, what's working for us, what is landing. And also the point around, well, if we weren't pushing any positive proactive pieces, then it would all be in the sort of negative red zone. And, equally, is that the place you want to be in as a business? So, it's sort of balancing out, but being realistic around this isn't a simple plus minus equation.
Yeah, great. And so those kind of topics, I'm sure some topics land differently with different types of stakeholder. And so you're able with this study to be able to pull apart how those different issues have landed with all of those groups.
Yeah, so I think, what we're showing today is a real snapshot of some of the data we get on a monthly basis. There is many, many more slides that we get, which kind of break all of this down for us, so we can really sort of delve into different topics. The previous slide was all about which topics are landing. This is all about sort of how are those topics playing out for different stakeholders. So we can see this gives us a bit of a snapshot of where we are versus the sector average in terms of our sort of key stakeholder groups. And, I think this does sort of show, I suppose, this example, in some cases we're sort of bang on sector average, somewhere behind and somewhere a bit ahead of. So, again, it's just a different way of cutting the data, but to give us that really rich insight and see how different topics land with different stakeholders, and therefore inform the approach that when we've got things coming up, we know which particular pieces we might want to be pushing with different stakeholders. And likewise, if we understand the topics that they're really interested in, we can get ahead of some, particularly if maybe we have some negative pieces coming up, we can get ahead of those. We can get a real sense of what our stakeholders are interested in.
That's great. Okay, so just thinking from the organisational standpoint, of course, setting up this sort of multi-stakeholder reputation tracker does span a lot of different departments in your organisation, and you use the word silos. I'm not going to put that in your mouth, but as it was something that was quite new to the organisation and was something that was spanning quite a lot of different parts of the organisation, how did you get people behind this internally?
Yeah, so we had the idea that this is what we wanted to do, and actually we were increasingly being asked in particular sort of stakeholder meetings, okay, well, what is the view on this, and what do our stakeholders think? And and as I said before, we had the data, but we had it in pockets, and it just wasn't really telling us, I guess, consistent, cohesive story. And also sometimes it wasn't particularly aligned to our strategy. It was more sort of, here's a lot of data and here's what it's telling us. So we had the ambition to bring this together. We very much started with the corporate affairs team. So we kind of went to the team with the idea and to get people on board, and we were very keen that if we were going to do this, it would only work if all the different teams were very much behind it, because if they just wanted to carry on and do what they were doing anyway, it wasn't really going to work. We were just going to have even more data in the mix. So I worked very closely with the head of media relations, the head of external affairs, to just really understand what they were doing already and how this might all sort of come together. And then, I think it's about sort of every step on the way, just making sure people feel involved in that decision, have an opportunity to feed in, to feedback. I think, as I said earlier, we're doing it as a pilot. We're very much testing, learning. So, we are tweaking as we go along, and we are kind of bringing in feedback at every sort of stage of that journey, which for us is really important, just to make sure people feel that they have a kind of active role in what we're doing. They understand the why, but they also have, that kind of ability to input into what we're getting. And then we're working, I think the next phase for us is about, we've kind of started with corporate affairs. We're now going out to the wider business to understand, well, what data do they have? So working very closely with our sales and marketing colleagues, also with our global team. They're looking to do similar things, track similar things. So kind of working closely and seeing where we can all really learn from each other and evolve this process. And we also have some client-facing tech teams, even, which have data that they use. So this is about kind of, we're in the phase really now of going around a lot of the kind of our key internal stakeholders, getting them on board with what we're doing and getting them to really understand what this is. And, that also includes the firm's leadership. I was actually at the executive committee on Friday talking our committee through what we were doing and through some of the insights that we've already gathered as part of doing this, and sort of how we're using it to inform our broader reputation strategy for the firm.
Brilliant. That sounds great. Right. I think we're getting towards the end of our content, not quite, but I would like to encourage anybody who's on the call to put some questions in the Q&A box at the bottom. If there's any burning questions you've got for, well, Amy in particular, or even me, you might have a question for me as well. And we will endeavour to answer them. But so I suppose my question here for Amy now is, what's your next plan? What's the plan for the future for this study, do you think?
Yeah, so, at the moment, obviously, we're tracking across our key external stakeholders. We do have ambitions in the future to bring in the employee voice and employee sentiment, and be also thinking about how does that show up. So, we're really interested in the idea of bringing that all together to show, I suppose, how does employee sentiment, how does it compare to when we're looking external sentiment, when there are things in the papers, does that flow through to our employees? So if anybody on this call has sort of cracked that one, then I'd be very keen to hear from anybody. We're also thinking through more broadly around, obviously this gives us a picture of our sentiment, but what we're also looking to do is, combine it with some more in-depth kind of stakeholder research to then sort of see how does this feed through into sort of trust levels, willingness to work with us, etc. So kind of demonstrating how that public sentiment actually feeds through into trust is something that we are sort of looking at and thinking about as well.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Right. So I can't see any questions as yet. So I think it's interesting what you say about employees, because we know that for an organisation such as yours, which is essentially a business-to-business one, that employees are one of your really big stakeholder groups, because we know that you're fighting over the same people, the same prospective employees with a lot of other organisations. So I'm being told that there are some questions, and it's obviously just my inability to see them. I can now see them. Thank you. Right. We have a question from Rebecca Bannister. Great question. Has this work had any impact on your team's capacity? Do you feel it's overworking you all, or is it being a help, I suppose?
No, I think for us it's really actually just helping to drive and inform what we're doing anyway. So we're not seeing this as sort of additional work. We're seeing this very much to kind of inform what we're doing overall. So I mean, because of the way our corporate affairs function at KPMG is set up, and because we do have a strategic communications team, the role of my team is actually that we are able to sort of have the capacity and the space to be thinking about the sort of longer term reputational challenges. And one part of my team is around particularly planning and insight. So this absolutely is a core part of my team. And then we work very closely with the rest of the function to kind of keep them updated. What are the headlines? What is this telling us? So that then people are using it to kind of inform their actions. But I would say, no, obviously there is work to do to set this up initially. That does take some extra capacity and some work, but on a monthly basis, the way we've set it up with Kantar, it's not really much additional work for us. It's just really great insight, which we then sort of feed into everything we're doing.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so there's a few questions on the same subject, which I can probably answer, which is this data based on social listening data only or quant survey data, and what kind of publicly accessible content do we use? A few people have asked this. So essentially it is mainstream content, so quite a deep analysis of what is being talked about in relation to KPMG and competitors in mainstream media, which is obviously a huge constituency. We then do also use social media, blogs, online articles, etc. And we do human analysis of all of those things to understand, true sentiment, not just because AI is great, but it's not great at the nuance, it's not great at the context. So we do a human analysis by stakeholder group, by competitor, to understand the sentiment and which themes and messages are landing with each of, how each of those stakeholder groups are responding to them. Now, in the case of this particular study, we are not currently incorporating any quant primary research sources. We can do, but that's not what this is at the moment. This is just reflecting what is being talked about in publicly accessible spaces. So hopefully that's just answered that set of questions. Great question here for Amy
Anna.
From Laura. Oh, sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to add that I think it relates back to the previous question, but what we find particularly useful is that when we get the monthly decks, it has all that analysis in it. So we're not having to go through a big sort of spreadsheet and kind of say, okay, well, what did cause that peak? What did cause, a low? That analysis is all done by Kantar and fed through. Now we can obviously adapt that or tweak it based on, the key points that we want to pull out. But that does really help in terms of we're not having to do all of that ourselves. I think it's just worth mentioning.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah. So there was a very good question from Laura McDonnell. So I see KPMG has a reputation committee. So how is this information used at that level and exec or board level, please, Amy?
Yeah, so we have a number of different sort of governance forums, as you might expect at a big organisation like KPMG. So I think, as I mentioned, executive committee, I went to them on Friday and talked them through what we're doing. So they're very interested in this work, and actually we're using it as a very good platform to then sort of go back to that committee and kind of say, okay, in terms of what next, what things might we like to do, it's providing us a good platform to do that. We also use it with our risk committee. So again, they're looking at it more from the perspective of what are the big risks coming down the line for the firm, and how might they potentially land externally. So we sort of use it from the perspective of seeing how things have landed in the past and then thinking about how they might land in the future. And we also are using it with our board to demonstrate, which kind of topics are cutting through for which different stakeholders. So at the moment, because we've only been doing this for, I think it was June, we've sort of started. You know, we're in the early stages, but we're really in that stakeholder engagement phase, and we're going around all the key committees to make sure that they know, one, that they know that we are doing this and they know the reason why, and they know that we have this data, and then to draw out the insights and show how it's really informing what we're doing, and so that they come away with a sense of, you know, our future activity is based, this, you know, insight, and this data is one part of the insight of kind of what we're doing.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so Michael Duncan asking, how much did this information study tracker confirm what you already suspected, and how much did it offer you new insights?
Yeah, so I think, you know, in some of the things come out and, you know, we're like, yeah, okay, that we kind of thought that, we, you know, it's sort of, it's reinforcing, I suppose, maybe some of the things we already knew. I think, interestingly, it is demonstrating how different topics are sort of cutting through with different audience groups. So I think an example would be around sort of some of the work that maybe our firm are doing or other firms are doing, particularly looking at things like government contracts. Now, obviously, that's a big topic in the media, but also that is a topic that really cuts through to the general public. So it's just interesting that certain topics, you know, kind of, I suppose, capture different audience groups in different ways, which is why we were very keen that, as well as having the overall score, we are able to break down by the different stakeholder groups. I think also, you know, the slide that we had earlier around the green and the red bars, for me, it's always so helpful because I can really unpick, okay, well, what are the key pieces of, for example, for us, what are the key pieces of research that really do sort of add value to us? And, you know, often there's a cost equation to some of those pieces of research. So, you know, it's kind of being able to demonstrate the value of, you know, some of what we're doing and what's working well. But it's, you know, it's interesting to see sometimes it's the mix of things that we do and sort of how they show up.
Yes, and I think you can start as you've built up almost a database of different types of content as well, haven't you? So the idea that, you know, this is what happens, this is the kind of maximum positive that we can expect from a big piece of research, for example, and this is the, you know, this is the kind of negative impact on this stakeholder group from this kind of story, and you can build up an idea of how much impact things are going to have going forward, so you can plan whether to sort of bundle or unbundle announcements, for example, going forward, you know, as you build up more sort of experience and more data behind you, I think.
Yeah.
Great. So a question from Sarah Roberts is about international coverage. Now, this is a UK only study, but the question, how do you manage international coverage? I mean, I suppose the beauty of doing something using publicly accessible data, or publicly accessible content rather, is that as long as you've got the language capability and the ability, you know, you can pretty much get your hands on the content you need and replicate this kind of study across different markets. You know, there are some special cases, you know, things like, you know, in the UK, we've got a certain way of looking at politicians, because it's not only about what they're talking about in mainstream and social media, it's also what they're talking about on the floor of the House of Commons, etc. And you know, so there's different ways of getting that information in different countries, but it is pretty much something that you can pick up and point at different parts of the world quite effectively, I think.
Yeah,
so,
and also sometimes. Oh, sorry, Anna. I was just going to say that sometimes actually, you know, stories that are actually global stories, or it might be a research piece that, you know, our US firm is doing. Sometimes that actually does show up on the tracker because it's kind of cut across borders. So I think, you know, sometimes it is, obviously this is tracking UK media and UK stakeholders, but it can be interesting to understand when a global story is coming through into our market. And I think likewise, our global teams are very interested about, you know, the opposite when a UK story is becoming global.
Yeah, and actually that feeds us really nicely into the next question, which comes from Nanako Kojiku, which is, you know, what are the challenges and limitations of this measurement model? So the idea that sentiment and share of voice can be very easily influenced by factors outside your control as a communications person. So, you know, scandals, you know, some of those big government stories which have gone badly wrong for some organisations. You know, are there any ways to control the data to be able to control for such elements?
I don't really think it's about controlling the data. I think for us, it's just drilling down into what is driving that, because then we can very clearly say to our stakeholders, we can say, okay, well, obviously a regulatory issue isn't something that the comms team are driving. We're obviously very involved in the response to those, but in terms of when it is reported on sort of actions that the business are taking, you know, I think you need that data in there because you need to demonstrate to internal stakeholders, well, this is how your business actions are actually being interpreted by your external stakeholders. So for us, it's really useful to actually have that mix of what are business actions, what are they doing, but also where are we as a comms function driving very proactive pieces to help, you know, move the overall sentiment score more into the positive zone. So you can kind of demonstrate where your team is having an impact, but also I think it goes back to the fundamental argument of making sure that comms has a very clear role and seat at the table when discussing these big reputational business actions that firms are taking, because you're able to then sort of demonstrate to your stakeholders, this is how that might play out based on sort of stakeholders, based on what we know, and kind of give them a clear insight into what might happen and therefore help to shape it.
Yeah, and I think just an observation from me about that is the fact that, you know, Amy's in a strategic role, the fact that she's not just measuring performance, she's interested in, you know, actually how do we stand up across the board and looking at that information quite unflinchingly. I think in possibly if the comms function was viewed with a bit less respect, as it is in some organisations, quite frankly, there might be the pressure to always be, demonstrating your performance. Whereas it sounds as if KPMG, there's a wider acceptance that maybe comms don't have full control over the fact that something's, you know, gone wrong in a different part of the organisation. I think that's a sign of maturity as an organisation, that you can look open-eyed and clear-eyed at the fact that something does go, does attract negative headlines, and it's about how you manage it. And the other thing is we've got, you know, other client situations where potentially we have staged a bit of an intervention on the data, because particularly with politicians, if there's a really, really hot potato issue and there are politicians who want to be seen to be making a lot of noise in order to speak to a very small set of their constituents or their followers, or, you know, and they're always just tweeting out the same stuff, and it's really an echo chamber. Nobody else is taking any notice of what they're saying. Sometimes we have actually just, you know, we've carried on tracking it, but we've possibly just, you know, looked at it in its own right as well. So rather than necessarily saying that that's indicative of something that's really negative, because maybe those guys were always negative, we know they're always negative, they're very, very prolific, we don't want that to be something that is sort of given as much weighting as possibly something that's a new emerging issue, because it just can drown everything else out. So it's quite rare that we do that, but it has been the case in the past that we've got involved and just, you know, kept an eye on it, but not necessarily included in the main study. And then the very last question from Paul Spindler is, Have you or are you intending to set yourself a KPI for your reputation score, Amy?
Oh, that's good. Yeah, I personally am not keen because I think, as we've alluded to, you know, some of this is out of our control, and you know, particularly the industry that KPMG operates within, we are in the headlines a lot at the moment, and you know, there is a lot of scrutiny on the profession, you know, which we fully accept. But I think to give ourselves a very crude KPI of, you know, our score must be plus whatever the figure is, I think, you know, sometimes then you can just get into again, it's kind of demonstrating that this isn't all a comms issue. This is about working very closely with the business in partnership to help to manage these issues. So I am not keen. I haven't been asked that question by leadership yet, and I'm hoping that it doesn't come up. But I think, you know, for us, it's about really using this insight to drive what we're doing. You know, I am very keen that this isn't, you know, we don't get this every month and then we kind of go, okay, we're number 3, all good, and then you don't look at the data and you don't analyze it. You know, we want to make sure that wherever we basically are on it, in some ways that's not as relevant as actually what is this telling us, and therefore how are we using it to inform, you know, things going forward. So yeah, let's hope that question doesn't come up from leadership, but I'm sure it will at some stage. Yeah.
I'm sure you'll manage it brilliantly. Well, thank you very much, Amy. That was brilliant, very insightful. And thank you for giving us your time and sharing your expertise. And thank you to the audience for your attention and engagement and all those great questions. Just a reminder that this is a 2-part webinar. So in our next session, we'll be joined by Peter Taylor from NatWest, who'll be talking about how they've instilled a measurement mindset in that business. And that's happening next Thursday, the 25th of November at 11. So I'm sure you'll all get a reminder. And so we'll sign off now. And I'd like to say once again, thank you very much for joining us, Amy. And thanks to all our audience for joining us today. Hope to see you next week.
Thanks very much, Anna.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.